The morning I saw Karen's SUV sitting squarely across my driveway, I knew it wasn't just an accident. Her headlights stared back like a dare, her tires crunching into my gravel as if she owned it. The cold morning air bit at my face as I stepped outside, coffee mug still warm in my hands. Steam rose from the cup, mixing with my visible breath in the October chill. The faint hiss of exhaust from her still-running engine filled the silence, and I could taste the metallic tang of frustration rising in my throat. Karen's pristine white Escalade sat there like a monument to entitlement, not just partially blocking my driveway, completely blocking it. The massive SUV stretched from my neighbor's fence line all the way to the edge of my property, creating an impenetrable wall of gleaming metal and chrome. Her personalized license plate, Karen HOA, seemed to mock me in the early morning light. I walked closer, my footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass. The vehicle was positioned with surgical precision, ensuring that even a bicycle couldn't squeeze through. This wasn't careless parking or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. This was war. Through the tinted windows, I could see movement. Karen sat in the driver's seat, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, her manicured fingers drumming against the steering wheel. She wasn't on the phone. She wasn't waiting for someone. She was just sitting there, watching, daring me to make the first move. The morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban street, highlighting the stark contrast between my modest home and the McMansions that dominated our neighborhood. Maple Valley Estates had once been a peaceful community, but that was before the Homeowners Association became Karen's personal kingdom. I approached the driver's side window, my breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The leather of my work boots squeaked against the dew-covered asphalt. Karen's window was down just a crack, enough for her to hear me, but not enough to suggest she wanted a conversation. "Karen," I said, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're blocking my driveway." She turned toward me with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who held all the cards, or thought she did. Her lips curled into a smile that never reached her eyes, those cold blue orbs that had intimidated half the neighborhood into submission. "Am I?" she asked, her voice dripping with false innocence. "I'm parked on a public street. Last I checked, you don't own the street, Dave." The way she said my name made it sound like a curse word. Her window rolled up another inch, the electric motor humming softly. She was enjoying this, savoring every second of my frustration like fine wine. "You're on my property line," I replied, pointing to where her rear bumper clearly crossed into my driveway. "And you're blocking my access to the street." Karen's laugh was sharp, cutting through the morning stillness like broken glass. "Property line? Oh, Dave, you really should read your HOA bylaws more carefully. Section 4.7 clearly states that vehicles may be parked anywhere on community streets, provided they don't violate city ordinances." She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a thick binder, its pages marked with colorful tabs and post-it notes. The HOA manual, her Bible, her weapon, her source of power over everyone who dared to call Maple Valley Estates home. "City Ordinance 12.4.8, she continued, flipping through the pages with practiced ease, states that vehicles cannot block driveways for more than 15 minutes during business hours. Since it's currently 6:47 a.m., well before business hours begin at 8:00 a.m., I'm well within my rights. The precision of her legal maneuvering was impressive and infuriating in equal measure. She had researched this, planned it, prepared for every argument I might make. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was calculated warfare. "I need to get to work," I said, gesturing toward my pickup truck trapped in the garage behind her vehicular barricade. "Then I suggest you leave earlier," Karen replied, her window now only open a sliver. "Or perhaps invest in a more reliable alarm clock. Personal responsibility is something we value highly in this community, Dave." The engine of her Escalade rumbled softly, a mechanical purr that seemed to mock my predicament. She had nowhere to be, nothing urgent calling her away. She could sit here all morning if she chose, and we both knew it. I stepped back from her window, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to call the police, to file a complaint, to follow proper channels. But Karen had thought of that too. She always did. "The police won't help you," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "Trust me, I've checked. Officer Martinez is very familiar with our community guidelines, and he agrees that HOA members have the right to park on community streets." She was right, of course. The police had been here before, called by other desperate homeowners who had fallen victim to Karen's particular brand of neighborhood terrorism. Each time they left without taking action, their hands tied by the complex web of HOA rules, city ordinances, and property rights that Karen navigated like a seasoned attorney. The sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the street. Other neighbors were beginning to stir, garage doors opening, morning routines beginning. But none of them would help. They couldn't afford to. Karen's retaliation against those who crossed her was swift and merciless. I pulled out my phone, considering my options. Call my boss and explain why I'd be late? Call a rideshare and abandon my truck? Give Karen the satisfaction of watching me scramble for alternatives while she sat there smug and untouchable? 10 minutes, I said finally, my voice carrying across the space between us. You said 15 minutes was the legal limit. You've been here 8. Karen's smile widened. Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it, Dave? But as I turned to walk back toward my house, something in her expression shifted. Just for a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across her features. Maybe it was the way I walked. Too calm, too composed for someone who had just been outmaneuvered. Maybe it was the lack of pleading or anger in my voice. Or maybe it was simply the quiet confidence that comes from knowing something your opponent doesn't. I didn't move her car, but 10 minutes later, it wasn't there anymore, and neither was her power. The morning air seemed to grow colder as I reached my front door, but for the first time in months, I felt warm inside. Karen thought she was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. What she didn't realize was that some games have rules she'd never learned, and some players had pieces she'd never seen. The sound of her engine continued to purr behind me, a constant reminder of her presence, her control, her seemingly unshakable position atop the Maple Valley Estates food chain. But sounds can be deceiving, and power, real power, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it simply makes a phone call. Moving to Maple Valley Estates had been my escape plan, my chance at a fresh start away from the chaos of city living. After my divorce, I needed peace, space, and the kind of quiet that only suburban life could provide. The real estate photos had shown tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and families walking their dogs in the golden hour light. What they hadn't shown was the iron fist wrapped in an HOA velvet glove. I'd thought I was buying a home. Instead, I'd walked into their playground of control. The first sign of trouble came during my 3rd week in the neighborhood. I was unpacking boxes in my garage when a shadow fell across the driveway. Karen Pemberton stood there in all her manufactured glory. Blonde hair teased to architectural heights. Designer athleisure wear that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and a smile that could cut glass. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she'd said, though her tone suggested she was anything but welcoming. "I'm Karen, your HOA representative. I just wanted to stop by and make sure you're familiar with our community standards." She handed me a thick packet of papers, the weight of it surprising in my hands. The Maple Valley Estates Homeowners Association Guidelines and Regulations, 147 pages of rules, restrictions, and requirements that governed everything from grass height to garage door color. "This is quite a lot," I'd said, flipping through pages of dense text and detailed diagrams. "Community standards are important," Karen replied, her eyes scanning my property like a predator sizing up prey. We work very hard to maintain property values here. I'm sure you understand. Behind her stood two other women, introduced as Linda Morrison and Jessica Hayes, fellow HOA board members who nodded along with Karen's words like synchronized swimmers. Linda was a thin woman with sharp features and sharper eyes, the type who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Jessica seemed friendlier, but there was something hollow about her smile, as if genuine warmth had been slowly drained away over years of HOA meetings. "Is that your truck?" Karen asked, pointing to my Ford F-150 parked in the driveway. "Yes, it is." She made a note on her clipboard. "Commercial vehicles aren't typically allowed in driveways overnight. Section 8.3 of the guidelines. But since you're new, I'll give you a grace period to find alternative parking arrangements." My truck wasn't commercial. It was my personal vehicle, used for weekend projects and the occasional camping trip, but arguing seemed pointless. These women had clearly done this dance before, and they knew all the steps. Over the following weeks, I learned about the neighborhood web that Karen had woven. Mark Stevens, the HOA president, was a man in his 50s who wore his authority like an expensive suit. Always visible, always pressed, always slightly too tight. He had the kind of forced joviality that politicians perfected, speaking in buzzwords about community enhancement and property value optimization, while his eyes remained cold and calculating. Mark's house sat at the corner of Maple and Valley Drive, a sprawling colonial that seemed designed to look down on the rest of the neighborhood. His lawn was perfect. Not a blade of grass out of place, not a single dandelion daring to sprout among the pristine Kentucky bluegrass. Sprinklers ran on precisely timed schedules, keeping everything green and controlled. Linda Morrison lived 3 houses down from me, in a Cape Cod-style home with shutters painted the exact shade of blue, mandated by HOA color charts. She was the neighborhood's unofficial intelligence network, always walking her small, yapping dog at strategic times to observe and report. Her husband, Paul, was a quiet man who seemed to shrink a little more each time I saw him, as if living with Linda was slowly erasing him from existence. The morning after Karen's first visit, Linda appeared at my mailbox just as I was leaving for work. Her little white dog, some kind of terrier mix, sniffed around my feet while she pretended to check her mail. Karen mentioned, "You have a truck," Linda said without preamble. "Commercial vehicles can really bring down property values, you know. The Hendersons 2 streets over had to sell their landscaping business truck because of complaints." I watched her carefully, noting how her eyes darted toward my windows, cataloging what she could see of my home's interior. This wasn't friendly conversation. It was reconnaissance. "It's not a commercial vehicle," I replied. "Just my personal truck." Linda's smile was razor-thin. "Of course. I'm sure Karen will work with you to find a solution that works for everyone." As weeks turned into months, I witnessed the full scope of Karen's campaign of control. She ruled through fear, using HOA regulations like a weapon against anyone who dared to deviate from her vision of suburban perfection. Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow who lived on Oakwood Circle, received a citation for having unauthorized garden ornaments. A small ceramic frog that had sat beside her roses for 15 years. When she protested that the frog predated the current HOA rules, Karen simply revised the regulations retroactively, adding a clause about maintaining community aesthetic standards regardless of installation date. The Johnsons were fined for having their teenage son's friends park on the street during a birthday party. Excessive vehicle congregation, Karen called it, though the same rule somehow didn't apply when Mark hosted his monthly poker nights. Tom Bradley, a veteran who lived alone in a modest ranch house, was cited for having non-conforming window treatments. His crime? Installing blackout curtains to help with his PTSD-related sleep issues. Karen demanded he replace them with HOA-approved blinds, regardless of his medical needs. Each citation came with a fine, and each fine that went unpaid resulted in a lien against the property. Karen had perfected a system of financial pressure that could drive families from their homes if they couldn't or wouldn't comply. But the worst part wasn't the fines or the citations. It was the way the neighborhood had learned to live in fear. Conversations at the mailbox were whispered. Children were hushed when they played too loudly. Neighbors avoided eye contact, afraid that showing sympathy for Karen's victims might make them targets themselves. I watched it all with growing disgust, but also with fascination. Karen had built something impressive in its terrible efficiency, a system of control that turned neighbors against each other, that made people police themselves and their children to avoid her attention. The monthly HOA meetings were exercises in theatrical democracy. Held in the community center that sat at the heart of Maple Valley Estates, they followed the same script each time. Mark would call the meeting to order. Linda would read minutes from the previous month, always approved unanimously, and Karen would present her community enhancement initiatives. Homeowners sat in folding chairs arranged in perfect rows, hands folded in their laps, speaking only when spoken to. Those brave enough to raise concerns were quickly shut down by parliamentary procedure or drowned out by Karen's interpretation of relevant bylaws. The health of our community depends on everyone following the same rules, Karen would say, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been successfully challenged. When we allow exceptions, we create chaos. When we create chaos, we destroy property values. And when we destroy property values, we destroy dreams. It was masterful manipulation, wrapping her power grab in language about protecting everyone's investment. Who could argue against protecting their own financial future? But I'd learned something during my years in the city, working construction jobs and dealing with building inspectors, city planners, and municipal bureaucrats. Every system had rules, and every rule had exceptions. Every authority had limits, and every limit had consequences when exceeded. Karen ruled Maple Valley Estates like a feudal queen. But feudal queens only held power as long as their subjects believed in their divine right to rule. And sometimes, all it took was one person willing to check the fine print to discover that the emperor's clothes were made of nothing but carefully crafted illusion. The night after Karen blocked my driveway, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and my laptop, diving deep into city ordinances, municipal codes, and state laws governing homeowners associations. What I found was interesting. What I didn't find was even more interesting. Karen thought she held all the cards because she'd memorized the HOA bylaws. But bylaws were just one layer of a much more complex legal structure, and they were far from the top layer. Above them sat city ordinances, county regulations, state laws, and federal protections. And Karen had made the fatal mistake of assuming that her little kingdom existed in a vacuum. As I scrolled through municipal websites and legal databases, I began to understand that Karen's power was built on a foundation of ignorance. Her neighbors' ignorance of their actual rights, and her own ignorance of the limits of her authority. The morning sun was beginning to rise as I closed my laptop, a plan forming in my mind. Karen had blocked my driveway, thinking it was just another display of dominance in her ongoing campaign of neighborhood terrorism. What she hadn't realized was that she'd finally picked the wrong target, someone who knew that the real power didn't come from HOA, bylaws, or community guidelines. Real power came from knowing which rules mattered most, and who had the authority to enforce them. The driveway incident was just Karen's opening move in what would become a months-long campaign of harassment designed to drive me from Maple Valley Estates. She had perfected this strategy over years of dealing with problem homeowners, and she applied it with the precision of a surgeon and the relentlessness of a machine. It started with the grass. 3 days after our driveway confrontation, I found a citation tucked under my windshield wiper. Violation of Community Standard 3.2, lawn maintenance requirements. The offense? My grass was allegedly 3.2 inches tall, which exceeded the maximum allowable height of 3.0 inches as specified in the HOA guidelines. I stared at the citation, then at my lawn. The grass looked identical to every other lawn on the street. Green, reasonably well maintained, unremarkable in every way. I grabbed a ruler from my kitchen and went outside to measure. 2 3/4 inches, nowhere near the alleged violation. But the citation was official, complete with timestamps, photographic evidence, and a $75 fine that would compound daily if left unpaid. The photos were taken with a professional-grade camera, close-up shots that somehow made my perfectly normal grass look unruly and neglected. I called the HOA office, reaching Jessica Hayes, who answered with practiced sympathy. "I understand your frustration, Dave," she said, her voice carrying the hollow ring of someone who'd had this conversation 100 times before. "But Karen is very thorough in her inspections. If she cited you for grass height, then your grass exceeded community standards. I measured it myself. It's under 3 inches. Did you measure it at the time the citation was issued? Grass grows, you know." The circular logic was maddening. There was no way to prove my grass hadn't been too long at the moment of Karen's inspection. No way to challenge her photographic evidence. No appeal process that didn't ultimately lead back to Karen herself. I paid the fine. But that only marked me as someone who would comply when pressured. It was exactly the wrong signal to send. The next citation came a week later. Unauthorized decorations. My crime? A small American flag hanging from a bracket beside my front door. The same flag that had hung there since Memorial Day. The same type of flag that adorned at least a dozen other homes in the neighborhood. This time, I did my research before paying. I discovered that the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 specifically prohibited HOAs from restricting homeowners' right to display the flag on their own property. I drafted a letter citing the federal law and delivered it to the HOA office personally. Karen's response arrived the next day. She didn't dispute the federal law. Instead, she cited a different violation: unauthorized hardware installation. The bracket holding my flag, she claimed, was installed without prior architectural approval as required by Section 12.4 of the HOA guidelines. The snap of her camera had become a familiar sound. I'd catch glimpses of her blonde hair behind fences, hear the mechanical click of her shutter as she documented every inch of my property. She photographed my mailbox, my front door, my windows, my driveway. Searching for violations like a detective at a crime scene, the sour stench of her perfume seemed to linger near my fence after her visits, a cloying mix of flowers and chemicals that spoke of someone trying too hard to mask something unpleasant underneath. Sometimes I'd find evidence of her presence: footprints in my flower bed, disturbed mulch where she'd knelt to get a better camera angle, tire tracks in the grass where she'd driven her Escalade partially onto my property for a clearer shot. But the photographs were only part of her strategy. Karen had weaponized the mail system, turning my mailbox into a delivery point for an endless stream of anonymous complaints, threatening letters, and friendly reminders about community standards. The letters arrived at all hours, slipped under my door like poisonous thoughts made manifest. Some were typed on official HOA letterhead. Others were handwritten in Karen's distinctive script. Still others appeared to come from concerned neighbors, though I suspected they all originated from the same source. "Your property maintenance is affecting neighborhood morale," read one. "Consider the impact your choices have on children and families." "Property values decline when homeowners ignore community standards," warned another. "Don't be the reason your neighbors lose their investments." The most insidious letters came disguised as legal notices, filled with official-sounding language about liens, foreclosure proceedings, and legal action. They were carefully crafted to seem legitimate while stopping just short of actual legal threats, designed to intimidate without quite crossing the line into harassment that could be prosecuted. Karen's timing was surgical in its precision. Citations arrived on Friday afternoons, ensuring I'd spend the weekend stewing over them. Anonymous letters appeared before holidays, poisoning family gatherings with stress and anxiety. Her driveway appearances seemed to coincide with my most important meetings, forcing me to scramble for alternative transportation or risk being late for work. The psychological warfare was relentless. She'd park her Escalade near my driveway, not quite blocking it, but close enough to make backing out difficult. She'd time her property inspections for when I was trying to relax in my backyard, standing at the fence line with her clipboard and camera, making notes and taking pictures while I tried to enjoy my morning coffee. Other neighbors began to whisper their sympathy, but always quietly, always when Karen wasn't around. They shared their own horror stories in hushed conversations by the mailbox or during chance encounters at the grocery store. She made us tear down our kids' swing set, Mrs. Patterson told me one evening, glancing around nervously as if Karen might materialize from the shadows. Said it violated setback requirements. Cost us $800 to have it professionally removed and reinstalled 3 feet further from the property line. The playground equipment citations, nodded Mr. Rodriguez, whose children I'd seen playing in his backyard just weeks before. She got us for unauthorized recreational structures, had to get architectural approval for a sandbox. A sandbox! But despite their sympathy, none of them would stand with me publicly. They'd learned through bitter experience that crossing Karen meant becoming her next target. She had files on everyone, photographs of minor infractions, records of late payments, documented violations going back years. Cross her, and suddenly your file would be reviewed with renewed scrutiny. The Hendersons had tried to fight back the year before. When Karen cited them for having their teenage daughter's car parked in the driveway overnight, they'd argued that single-family homes were allowed to have multiple vehicles on their property. Karen's response was swift and devastating. Within a week, they'd received citations for 17 different violations, everything from mailbox, paint fade to insufficient hedge trimming to excessive noise. From their air conditioning unit, they'd sold their house 3 months later, unable to afford the mounting fines and legal fees. Karen had attended their going-away party, bringing a casserole and expressing her regret that they'd decided to leave the neighborhood. Now, those same neighbors watched my harassment campaign unfold with a mixture of sympathy and relief. Sympathy for my situation, relief that Karen's attention was focused on someone else. They'd learned to keep their heads down, to follow every rule precisely, to live small lives that wouldn't attract her notice. But I'd noticed something during those whispered conversations. Karen's power relied on isolation, turning her targets into pariahs, making them fight alone against an opponent who seemed to have unlimited resources and authority. She counted on people being too intimidated, too exhausted, or too financially strapped to fight back effectively. What she hadn't counted on was someone who understood that her authority, like all authority, had limits. Someone who knew that her perfectly crafted system of control had vulnerabilities she'd never anticipated. The anonymous letters kept coming, the citations multiplied, and Karen's surveillance of my property intensified. But with each escalation, she was providing me with something valuable: documentation of her harassment, evidence of her abuse of power, and a clear pattern of behavior that would be very difficult to explain to the right authorities. Every scream, every letter, every arrogant step she took, I logged, because I knew that one day it would all be evidence. The morning she blocked my driveway for the second time, I was ready, not with anger or frustration, but with something far more dangerous to someone like Karen: knowledge, documentation, and connections she didn't know I had. She thought she was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. What she didn't realize was that some of us had learned to play an entirely different game. with rules she'd never studied and pieces she'd never seen. And the first move in that game wasn't to attack her directly. It was to quietly gather the tools that would make her fortress of fake authority crumble from within. What they didn't know was that I had something far more powerful than their HOA bylaws. The revelation came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape I thought I knew. For months, I'd been fighting Karen's harassment campaign on her terms, within the narrow confines of HOA regulations and neighborhood politics. I'd been playing defense, reacting to her moves, trying to survive in a game where she'd written all the rules. But rules, I'd learned during my years working municipal construction projects, were layered things. HOA bylaws sat at the bottom of a complex hierarchy of authority, and above them towered city ordinances, county regulations, state laws, and federal protections, each level superseding the ones below. More importantly, I had something Karen didn't: access to the people who enforced the rules that actually mattered. My brother Danny worked for the city's Code Enforcement Division, the department responsible for ensuring that all properties within city limits complied with municipal ordinances and zoning requirements. We'd grown up together, served as each other's best man, and maintained the kind of close relationship that made family gatherings feel like strategy sessions between old friends. "You're dealing with an HOA nightmare?" Danny had asked during our monthly beer night, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd seen this story play out too many times. "Man, those people think they run their own little kingdoms." "This one actually might," I'd replied, showing him some of Karen's more creative citations. "She's got the whole neighborhood terrorized." Danny studied the papers with professional interest, his experienced eye catching details that others might miss. As a code enforcement officer, he dealt with hundreds of HOA disputes, property line disagreements, and neighborhood feuds. He knew the difference between legitimate violations and manufactured outrage. "Half of these citations are bogus," he said, after reviewing Karen's documentation. "Grass height? Unless you're running a hayfield, we don't care. Flag brackets? That's protected federal expression. And this noise complaint about your air conditioning?" He laughed. "We've got actual noise ordinances with decibel measurements and time restrictions. Her feelings don't constitute a violation." But the real breakthrough came when Danny pulled up the city's property records on his laptop, showing me the complex web of regulations, easements, and restrictions that governed Maple Valley estates. "Here's what your HOA queen doesn't understand," he said, pointing to a series of code numbers on the screen. "She thinks her bylaws are the ultimate authority, but they're only valid as long as they don't conflict with municipal ordinances. The moment they cross that line, city law trumps HOA rules." He showed me the hierarchy: federal law at the top, then state regulations, county codes, municipal ordinances, and finally, at the very bottom of the power structure, homeowners association bylaws. Each level could override the ones below it, and Danny had the authority to enforce everything from federal housing protections down to local zoning requirements. "The beautiful thing about code enforcement," Danny continued, "is that we investigate complaints, not politics. If someone violates city ordinances, we cite them. Period. Doesn't matter if they're the mayor's wife or the HOA president's best friend." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks as Karen's harassment campaign escalated. Every citation she issued, every anonymous letter she sent, every time she blocked my driveway or trespassed on my property to take photographs, it all created a documented pattern of behavior that extended far beyond HOA authority. I began to see Karen's actions through Danny's professional lens. Her surveillance activities crossed into stalking territory. Her anonymous letters constituted harassment. Her driveway blocking violated multiple traffic ordinances, and her selective enforcement of HOA rules, applying strict standards to me while ignoring identical violations by her allies, suggested discrimination that could trigger federal housing protections. But the most interesting discovery came when I researched Karen's own property through the city's online record system. Her immaculate Escalade, it turned out, was registered as a commercial vehicle, not because she ran a business, but because she'd claimed tax deductions for using it in her capacity as an HOA board member, technically making it a commercial vehicle under city classification. Municipal Ordinance 12.7.3 was crystal clear. Commercial vehicles could not be parked in residential driveways between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. without a special permit. The same rule Karen had used to threaten me about my personal pickup truck applied even more strongly to her own SUV, which was legally classified as commercial equipment. Better yet, the city took commercial vehicle violations seriously because they affected neighborhood traffic patterns and property values, the exact concerns Karen claimed to champion. Violations carried significant fines and could result in immediate towing if the vehicle posed a traffic hazard, which brought me to the most valuable connection in my growing arsenal. Tony Ricci, my old friend from construction work, who now operated the city's contracted towing service. Tony and I had worked together on a dozen municipal projects, and he understood better than anyone how the complex relationships between city codes, traffic enforcement, and property rights actually functioned. Commercial vehicle in a residential driveway? Tony whistled when I showed him the registration records. That's a $500 fine and immediate tow. No warnings, no grace period. City Council cracked down on that stuff last year after some landscaping companies started using suburban neighborhoods as equipment storage. Tony explained the enforcement mechanism. When code enforcement identified a commercial vehicle violation, they issued an immediate removal order. If the vehicle wasn't moved within 2 hours, it got towed to the city impound lot. Owners had to pay both the fine and the towing storage fees before getting their vehicle back. And the costs mounted quickly. $500 fine, $150 towing fee, $75 per day storage, plus administrative costs. The beautiful part, Tony added with a grin, is that it's completely objective. Either a vehicle is legally parked or it isn't. No appeals process, no HOA politics, no community meetings, just city ordinance and immediate enforcement. Armed with this knowledge, I began to see Karen's campaign against me in an entirely new light. She'd been using her HOA position to selectively enforce minor rules while being a flagrant violator of major municipal ordinances herself. Her power came from other people's ignorance of their actual rights and her own ignorance of her legal vulnerabilities. Every time she blocked my driveway, she was violating traffic ordinances. Every time she trespassed on my property to take photographs, she was breaking laws that had nothing to do with HOA authority. Every time she parked her commercial vehicle in her residential driveway overnight, she was committing the exact type of violation she'd threatened to cite me for. But the most powerful tool in my arsenal wasn't the legal technicalities or the enforcement connections. It was the documentation I'd been accumulating. Every citation Karen had issued, every anonymous letter she'd sent, every photograph she'd taken of my property, every time she'd blocked my driveway or lingered at my fence line with her clipboard and camera. It all painted a clear picture of systematic harassment that extended far beyond HOA authority and into territory that city, county, and federal agencies took very seriously. Karen thought her HOA bylaws made her untouchable, but she'd been building a legal case against herself with every petty act of neighborhood terrorism. The morning she blocked my driveway for the second time, I knew exactly what to do. Not because I was angry or desperate, but because I finally understood the game we were really playing. Karen thought her SUV made her untouchable, parking wherever she pleased while threatening others for identical behavior. What she didn't realize was how quickly steel and rubber can disappear. When the law says so, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, finding Danny's number. But I didn't call him yet. First, I took photographs from multiple angles. documenting not just the blocked driveway, but the license plate that would identify her vehicle as commercial, the precise positioning that violated traffic ordinances, and the timestamp that would prove premeditation. Then I made the call that would change everything. "Hey, Danny. It's Dave. I need to report a commercial vehicle violation in a residential area. The vehicle is currently blocking a driveway in violation of municipal traffic codes, and I have photo documentation ready for your review." Karen thought she was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. What she didn't realize was that some of us had learned to play an entirely different game, one where the rules actually mattered, where documentation trumped intimidation, and where real authority came from knowing which laws superseded HOA bylaws. Her car was gone in 10 minutes, but something else vanished with it. The illusion that her HOA kingdom was beyond the reach of actual justice. The transformation began in whispers, with neighbors approaching me like resistance fighters emerging from the shadows. Word had spread about Karen's latest driveway stunt and its sudden resolution, and for the first time in years, people in Maple Valley Estates were beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, Karen Pemberton wasn't as untouchable as she seemed. Mrs. Chen was the first to approach me directly. I found her waiting by my mailbox one evening, her small frame dwarfed by the enormous oak tree that shaded the corner of my property. At 83, she'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, had watched it transform from a quiet community into Karen's personal fiefdom. "I saw what happened this morning," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being observed. "With the tow truck. With her car." Her voice carried a mixture of admiration and fear, like someone who'd witnessed a miracle, but wasn't sure if it was safe to believe in it yet. "She's been targeting you," Mrs. Chen continued, "the same way she targeted us before Harold died. Always taking pictures, always finding violations that didn't exist for anyone else." Her husband, Harold, had passed away 2 years earlier, and Karen had used his death as an opportunity to intensify her harassment campaign. The day after the funeral, Mrs. Chen had received a citation for excessive memorial decorations, the small garden stones that Harold's grandchildren had painted with messages of love and remembrance. "She made me remove them," Mrs. Chen whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Said they violated the community's aesthetic standards. I had to throw away the last gifts my grandchildren made for their grandfather." But that was only the beginning. Karen had targeted Mrs. Chen with the systematic precision of a predator sensing weakness. Citations for grass height that was identical to her neighbor's. Fines for holiday decorations that had been approved for years. Threats about her small vegetable garden, which Karen claimed violated landscaping requirements despite being specifically allowed under the original HOA covenants. "I've been keeping records," Mrs. Chen said, pulling a worn manila folder from her purse. "Every citation, every photograph, every time she's trespassed on my property. Harold always said that bullies only win when good people stay silent." The folder was thick with documentation, not just of her own harassment, but of Karen's campaign against the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Chen had been watching, recording, and documenting for months, creating a comprehensive record of Karen's abuse of power. "I'm not the only one," she added. "There are others, people who are afraid to speak up alone, but might be willing to stand together." Over the following weeks, they came to me one by one, like survivors of a disaster finally willing to share their stories. Each conversation took place in careful privacy. My backyard after dark, the grocery store parking lot, brief encounters during morning walks when Karen's Escalade wasn't prowling the streets. Tom Bradley, the veteran with PTSD, had endured months of targeted harassment after requesting accommodation for his blackout curtains. Karen had not only denied his request, but had escalated her surveillance of his property, taking photographs through his windows and documenting his every movement. She'd filed noise complaints about his service dog, tried to have his veteran license plates declared non-conforming, and even called the police with false reports about suspicious activity at his home. She knows exactly which buttons to push. Tom told me during a quiet conversation in my garage. The noise complaints, the police calls. She's triggering my hypervigilance on purpose. She wants me to have episodes so she can claim I'm a danger to the community. The Johnsons had been targeted for the crime of having teenage children. Karen treated their kids like criminals, photographing them walking home from school, citing the family for excessive youth congregation when friends came over to study, and filing complaints about noise levels that were well within legal limits during appropriate hours. She followed my daughter home from the bus stop, Mrs. Johnson told me, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. 17 years old, and this grown woman is stalking her with a camera, claiming she was documenting potential violations. The pattern was always the same. Karen would identify someone she perceived as vulnerable or non-compliant, then systematically escalate her harassment until they either submitted completely to her authority or fled the neighborhood entirely. She'd perfected a system of psychological warfare that turned homes into prisons and neighbors into informants. But the most shocking revelations came from Linda Morrison's husband, Paul. I encountered him one evening while taking out my garbage, and he approached me with the desperate urgency of someone who'd been holding secrets too long. "She's planning something," he whispered, glancing back at his house where Linda's silhouette moved behind the kitchen curtains. "Karen's planning something big for you. They've been meeting at our house, going through files, preparing some kind of coordinated campaign." Paul's access to Karen's inner circle had given him a window into the sophisticated machinery of her harassment operation. She maintained detailed files on every household in the neighborhood, complete with photographs, financial records obtained through public databases, and personal information gathered through careful surveillance and social media monitoring. She knows your work schedule, your habits, your vulnerabilities, Paul continued. She's been researching your divorce records, your employment history, looking for pressure points she can exploit. The revelation was chilling but not entirely surprising. Karen's attacks had always been too precisely timed, too perfectly calibrated to cause maximum disruption. She wasn't just an angry neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was a skilled psychological predator who studied her targets with scientific precision. But Paul's information also revealed something else. Karen was growing desperate. The sudden removal of her Escalade had shaken her confidence, and she was escalating her tactics in response. She was planning what she called a comprehensive enforcement action, a coordinated campaign of citations, fines, and legal threats designed to force me out of the neighborhood once and for all. "She's been talking to lawyers," Paul whispered, "looking for ways to force you to sell. She wants to make an example of you, show everyone what happens when someone challenges her authority." As disturbing as this information was, it also represented an opportunity. Karen's desperation was making her reckless, and her escalation would only provide more documentation of her harassment campaign. Every action she took against me would be evidence of systematic abuse of power that extended far beyond HOA authority. I began meeting regularly with my growing group of allies, always in private, always with careful attention to security. We shared information, documented ongoing harassment, and began to build a comprehensive case that revealed the true scope of Karen's reign of terror. Mrs. Chen's records went back 3 years and showed a clear pattern of selective enforcement. The Johnsons had documentation of Karen's inappropriate surveillance of their children. Tom Bradley's files revealed potential civil rights violations in Karen's targeting of his disability accommodations. Even Paul Morrison, despite his wife's alliance with Karen, provided crucial intelligence about upcoming harassment campaigns. But the most valuable ally came from an unexpected source, Jessica Hayes, the hollow-eyed HOA board member who had always seemed like Karen's loyal lieutenant. She appeared at my door one evening, her usual forced smile replaced by an expression of exhausted desperation. "I can't do this anymore," she said simply. "I can't be part of what Karen's doing to this neighborhood." Jessica's revelation was stunning. She'd been documenting Karen's activities for months, not as an ally, but as someone who'd grown increasingly horrified by the woman she'd helped empower. She had recordings of HOA board meetings where Karen discussed her harassment campaigns in explicit detail, financial records showing how HOA funds were being misused for personal vendettas, and correspondence revealing Karen's coordination with Mark Stevens and Linda Morrison in targeting specific homeowners. "She's not just violating HOA rules," Jessica told me, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's breaking actual laws. The surveillance, the harassment, the financial manipulation, it's all illegal. I kept records because I knew some days someone would have to stop her." Every scream, every letter, every arrogant step Karen had taken, we'd logged it all, because we knew that one day it would all be evidence. The neighborhood that had lived in fear for so long was finally finding its voice, not through confrontation or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet, methodical work of documentation and truth-telling. We were building something that Karen had never faced before. A united front of neighbors who refused to be intimidated, who understood their actual rights, and who had the evidence to prove that her empire of fear was built on nothing more than carefully constructed lies. Karen thought she was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. What she didn't realize was that we'd stopped playing her game entirely. We were playing for keeps now, with rules that mattered and stakes that extended far beyond her petty kingdom of neighborhood control. The morning she made her next move against me, we were ready. Not just me, but all of us. A community that had learned to stand together against a bully who had never faced real consequences for her actions. And consequences, as Karen was about to discover, could be as swift and implacable as a tow truck's hook and chain. The morning Karen chose to make her final statement, she outdid herself in both arrogance and tactical stupidity. Her pristine white Escalade sat across my driveway like a monument to entitlement, positioned with surgical precision to ensure maximum disruption while still maintaining the pretense of being legally parked on a public street. But this time was different. This time, she'd made a critical error in timing. It was 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, well within the city's designated business hours for commercial vehicle enforcement. Her SUV wasn't just blocking my driveway, it was sitting in clear violation of Municipal Ordinance 12.7.3, its commercial registration making it an illegal presence in a residential area during restricted hours. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen initially, but her engine was running, the Escalade's exhaust creating small clouds in the crisp morning air. She was making a statement. This wasn't hurried or accidental. This was deliberate, calculated, and designed to demonstrate her absolute authority over the neighborhood. I stood in my kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, and made a single phone call. "Danny? It's Dave. That commercial vehicle situation we discussed? It's happening right now." My brother's response was immediate and professional. "Address? 1247, Maple Valley Drive. White Escalade, license plate Karen HOA, blocking a residential driveway. Commercial registration, no permit for residential parking. Photo documentation? Multiple angles, timestamps, clear view of license plate and positioning. I'm 15 minutes out. Keep documenting." The beauty of code enforcement was its mechanical precision. No politics, no negotiation, no appeals to community harmony. Just objective violation of municipal ordinance, documented evidence, and immediate consequence. I moved to my front window, phone camera ready, and began recording. The Escalade sat like a sleeping giant, its chrome details catching the morning sun, its massive presence dwarfing the modest suburban street. Through the tinted windows, I could see Karen's silhouette. She was reading something, probably the HOA bylaws, preparing her legal justification for this latest act of neighborhood terrorism. As if summoned by some sixth sense, Karen emerged from her vehicle. She wore her usual uniform of designer athleisure and manufactured authority, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Her heels clicked against the asphalt as she surveyed her handiwork, a smile of satisfaction playing across her lips. She noticed me watching from my window, and her smile widened. This was exactly the reaction she'd wanted. Me trapped, frustrated, forced to acknowledge her power over my daily life. She even had the audacity to wave, a small gesture that managed to convey both false friendliness and absolute contempt. What Karen didn't notice was the low rumble approaching from Valley Drive, the grinding of gears and the metallic clink of chains that announced the arrival of municipal authority in its most direct form. Danny's white pickup truck rounded the corner first, followed closely by Tony Ricci's massive tow truck. The sight of those two vehicles together was beautiful in its implications: code enforcement and immediate consequence, arriving in perfect synchronization like the components of a well-designed machine. Karen's expression shifted as she processed what she was seeing. The confident smile faltered, replaced by confusion, and then growing alarm as the tow truck's warning lights began flashing, casting alternating amber and red reflections across the suburban morning. Danny stepped out of his pickup, wearing the official vest and badge of the City Code Enforcement Division. His clipboard was already out, his camera ready, his entire demeanor radiating the calm professionalism of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "Ma'am," Danny called to Karen, his voice carrying the polite but firm tone of municipal authority. "Is this your vehicle?" Karen's recovery was swift, but not quite swift enough to hide her initial panic. "Yes, it is. And I'm parked legally on a public street." "Actually, ma'am, you're not." Danny consulted his clipboard, reviewing the violation report I'd filed. "This vehicle is registered as commercial equipment, which makes it subject to municipal ordinance 12.7.3. Commercial vehicles cannot be parked in residential areas between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. without a special permit." "This isn't a commercial vehicle," Karen protested, but her voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "It's my personal SUV." Danny pulled out his tablet, accessing the city's vehicle registration database in real time. License plate Karen HOA, registered to Karen Pemberton, classification code C7 to commercial. Tax records show depreciation claims filed for business use in HOA management activities. The precision of Danny's response was devastating. Karen had used her vehicle's commercial classification to claim tax benefits, but that same classification now made her subject to commercial vehicle restrictions she'd never considered. Meanwhile, Tony had been examining the Escalade's position relative to my driveway, taking measurements and photographing the violation from multiple angles. His professional assessment was swift and definitive. "Clear driveway obstruction," he announced. "Vehicle positioning blocks residential access in violation of municipal traffic codes. Immediate removal authorized." That's when Karen began to scream. The sound cut through the suburban morning like a siren, high-pitched and desperate, all pretense of authority and control stripped away in an instant. Her carefully constructed image of neighborhood queen collapsed into something raw and panicked as she realized that her usual weapons were useless against municipal authority. "You can't do this," she shrieked, lipstick smeared as she gestured wildly at my house. "He called you. This is harassment. This is retaliation." Danny's response was delivered with the patience of someone who'd heard every excuse and legal theory imaginable. "Ma'am, code enforcement responds to violations, not politics. The vehicle is illegally parked regardless of who reported it." "I know my rights," Karen continued, her voice growing more shrill with each word. "I'm on the HOA board. I have authority here. HOA authority doesn't supersede municipal ordinances, ma'am, Danny replied calmly, and this vehicle is in clear violation of city codes. By now, neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the unusual sight of official vehicles on their quiet street. Mrs. Chen stood on her front porch, her hand pressed to her mouth in amazement. The Johnsons had gathered at their front window, their teenage daughter recording the scene on her phone. Even Paul Morrison had ventured outside, though he kept his distance from his wife's closest ally. Karen noticed the audience and seemed to realize that her public breakdown was being witnessed by the very people she'd terrorized for years. She tried to regain her composure, smoothing her hair and adjusting her clothes, but the damage was done. The mask of authority had slipped too far to be repositioned. "I demand to speak to your supervisor," she said, her voice still shaking despite her attempt at control. "You're welcome to file a complaint with the city," Danny replied, "but the violation stands, and the vehicle needs to be removed immediately." Tony had finished his assessment and was now maneuvering his tow truck into position. The massive machine backed up with mechanical precision, its warning beepers adding to the symphony of Karen's humiliation. The hydraulic systems engaged with a deep thrumming sound as the tow arm extended toward the Escalade. "No!" Karen rushed toward her SUV, heels clacking against the pavement. "You can't take my car!" "Ma'am, you need to step back for safety reasons," Tony called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd handled hundreds of tow situations. "The vehicle is being impounded under municipal authority." The hook engaged with a solid metallic clank, securing itself to the Escalade's frame with the finality of a judge's gavel. Chains rattled as they were attached, creating an unbreakable connection between Karen's symbol of power and the city's enforcement mechanism. Karen stood helpless as her pristine white SUV was lifted from the ground, its tires slowly rising until they hung suspended in midair. The vehicle that had been her weapon of choice, her mobile command center for neighborhood surveillance and harassment, now dangled from a tow truck like a caught fish. "This is illegal!" she screamed one final time, but her voice was lost in the rumble of the tow truck's engine as Tony prepared to haul her vehicle away. In 10 minutes, the driveway was clear. The Escalade disappeared around the corner, followed by Danny's pickup truck, leaving behind only the fading sound of diesel engines and the stunned silence of neighbors who'd witnessed the impossible. Karen stood alone on the asphalt, her authority as vanished as her vehicle, looking for the first time like what she'd always been beneath the designer clothes and manufactured confidence, a bully whose power had finally met its match. But something else had vanished with her car, her illusion of power, her ability to terrorize with impunity, and her neighbor's belief that she was untouchable. The very people who once made us whisper behind curtains were now too ashamed to show their faces, while those of us who'd suffered under their reign of petty tyranny stood a little straighter in the morning sun. Justice, it turned out, sometimes came with a tow. Trucks roar and the sweet sound of chains, dragging a bully's pride away to impound. Karen's initial response to losing her Escalade was predictably explosive and ultimately self-destructive. Within hours of the towing incident, she'd fired off a barrage of emails, phone calls, and formal complaints to every authority she could think of: the mayor's office, the city council, the police department, even the local news stations. Each communication was more desperate and less coherent than the last, revealing the depth of her panic as her carefully constructed world began to crumble. But Karen's greatest mistake was doubling down on the very tactics that had already exposed her vulnerabilities. Instead of retreating and regrouping, she escalated her harassment campaign with the fury of someone who believed that enough noise and intimidation could overcome inconvenient facts. The evidence I'd been collecting suddenly became invaluable as Karen's desperation made her reckless. Every angry voicemail she left, every threatening letter she sent, every public outburst at City Hall, It all built a comprehensive case that her behavior had crossed far beyond legitimate HOA authority into criminal harassment territory. My brother Danny had seen cases like this before, where small-time neighborhood dictators overplayed their hands and attracted the attention of authorities who operated on a completely different level. Karen's complaints about the towing incident triggered a review of the entire situation, and what the city found was disturbing even by municipal standards. She's been filing false reports, Danny told me over coffee a few days after the towing incident. Not just exaggerated HOA violations, but actual false police reports, fraudulent noise complaints, even bogus code enforcement requests against her enemies. The city's investigation had uncovered a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond my situation. Karen had been weaponizing municipal services for years, filing frivolous complaints that wasted taxpayer resources while targeting neighbors she wanted to intimidate. She'd made false reports about illegal home businesses, non-existent noise violations, and imaginary health hazards, all designed to subject her enemies to official scrutiny and expensive compliance procedures. But the most damaging discovery came when investigators audited the HOA's financial records. Jessica Hayes had provided detailed documentation of how Karen had been misusing association funds for personal vendettas, spending homeowner dues on private investigators, legal consultations for harassment campaigns, and even hiring photographers to conduct surveillance on residents she wanted to target. Fiduciary fraud, Danny explained. She's been using other people's money to fund her personal war against the neighborhood. That's not just HOA misconduct, that's embezzlement. Mark Stevens, the HOA president who'd enabled Karen's reign of terror, found himself caught in the crossfire of the investigation. His attempts to distance himself from Karen's actions only highlighted his complicity in the harassment campaigns. Email records showed his approval of expenditures for community enhancement investigations that were actually stalking and surveillance operations against specific homeowners. Linda Morrison, Karen's faithful lieutenant, made the catastrophic decision to double down on loyalty to her fallen leader. When investigators interviewed her about the HOA's activities, she provided a detailed defense of Karen's methods that inadvertently documented years of systematic harassment and abuse of power. We were protecting property values, Linda insisted during her recorded interview with city investigators. Karen was just enforcing community standards against people who refused to comply with basic decency. But Linda's own records, seized as part of the investigation, told a different story. Her detailed surveillance logs, complete with photographs and personal information about targeted residents, painted a picture of an organized harassment campaign that had nothing to do with legitimate property maintenance concerns. The breaking point came when the investigation expanded beyond Maple Valley Estates. Other neighborhoods began reporting similar patterns of harassment from Karen's consulting work with their HOAs. She'd been selling her community enhancement services to HOA boards across the county, exporting her methods of intimidation and control to suburban developments throughout the region. Mrs. Patterson from Oakwood Circle contacted investigators after learning about Karen's downfall, providing documentation of a harassment campaign that had driven her family from their previous neighborhood 3 years earlier. The Hendersons, who'd fled Maple Valley Estates the year before, emerged from hiding to tell their story of systematic persecution and financial destruction. "She's not just a problem for our neighborhood," Mrs. Chen told the packed city council meeting where Karen's fate was ultimately decided. "She's been a cancer spreading through our entire community, destroying families and terrorizing anyone who dared to question her authority." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial fraud, harassment, stalking, filing false reports, misuse of public resources, civil rights violations. Karen's empire of fear had been built on a foundation of actual crimes, not just petty tyranny, but the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: Paul Morrison. Linda's long-suffering husband, who'd finally found the courage to speak truth to power. His testimony to investigators revealed the inner workings of Karen's operation with the detail that only a reluctant insider could provide. She kept files on everyone. Paul told the hushed council chamber, personal information, financial records, family problems, anything she could use to pressure people into submission. She called it community management, but it was blackmail. Paul's revelation led to the discovery of Karen's most damaging secret, a comprehensive database of personal information about every resident in multiple neighborhoods, complete with surveillance photographs, financial records obtained through questionable means, and detailed psychological profiles designed to identify pressure points for future harassment campaigns. The database was devastating. Evidence of a systematic violation of privacy rights that extended far beyond HOA authority. Karen had essentially been running a private intelligence operation against her own neighbors, collecting and storing personal information for the explicit purpose of intimidation and control. Mark Stevens resigned within 48 hours of the database's discovery, releasing a carefully worded statement that blamed Karen for exceeding her authority while attempting to minimize his own culpability. Linda Morrison lasted another week before the mounting evidence forced her to step down as well, leaving the HOA board in complete collapse. But the investigation's most shocking revelation came when financial auditors discovered the full scope of Karen's misuse of HOA funds. She hadn't just been spending homeowner dues on harassment campaigns. She'd been systematically draining the association's reserve funds to finance her expanding operations. The money that should have been maintaining common areas, funding legitimate community improvements, and building reserves for future needs had instead been spent on private investigators, surveillance equipment, legal consultations for harassment lawsuits, and even payments to outside consultants who helped Karen refine her intimidation techniques. She stole nearly $200,000 over 3 years, the lead auditor reported to the city council. Money that belonged to the homeowners she claimed to represent, diverted to fund personal vendettas against people she wanted to destroy. The criminal charges came swift and comprehensive: embezzlement, harassment, stalking, filing false reports, violation of privacy rights, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Karen's arrest was as public and humiliating as her years of neighborhood terrorism had been private and calculating. The sight of her being led away in handcuffs, her perfect blonde hair disheveled, and her designer outfit wrinkled, marked the end of an era for Maple Valley Estates. The woman who'd made grown adults whisper, "In fear and children play quietly," to avoid her attention was finally facing consequences that matched her crimes. Mark Stevens faced civil liability for his role in enabling Karen's harassment campaigns, ultimately settling out of court for an undisclosed sum that rumor placed in the 6-figure range. Linda Morrison found herself ostracized by the very neighbors she'd helped terrorize, her marriage to Paul ending as he finally freed himself from her toxic influence. The HOA itself was placed under court supervision, while new leadership was elected and financial controls were implemented. The organization that had been Karen's weapon of choice became a symbol of accountability and transparency, with resident input and oversight replacing the secretive authoritarianism that had defined the previous regime. But the most satisfying consequence wasn't legal or financial, it was social. Karen's supporters, the enablers and beneficiaries of her reign of terror, found themselves as isolated and powerless as their victims had once been. The very people who'd made others whisper behind curtains were now too ashamed to show their faces at neighborhood gatherings or community events. Meanwhile, those of us who'd suffered under Karen's harassment found our voices and our power. Neighbors who'd lived in fear for years began speaking openly about their experiences, sharing stories that revealed the true scope of the damage that one bully with fake authority could inflict on an entire community. The neighborhood breathed again, kids' laughter returning to the streets, open driveways free from citation threats, and the beautiful sound of people living their lives without fear of petty retaliation from self-appointed guardians of suburban perfection. Cinematic justice had finally arrived, not with dramatic confrontation or violent revenge, but with the quiet power of documentation, investigation, and accountability. The chains Karen and the HOA had tried to wrap around our community hadn't just broken, they'd been transformed into evidence of crimes that would follow her long after her Escalade disappeared from our streets, forever. 6 months after Karen's arrest, Maple Valley Estates had transformed into something I'd only imagined when I first moved here. A real community where neighbors knew each other's names instead of their violations, where children played without fear of citations, and where home truly meant sanctuary, rather than surveillance state. The changes were both dramatic and subtle, like watching a garden bloom after a killing frost finally lifts. Mrs. Chen's grandchildren returned to visit regularly, their painted memorial stones restored to Harold's garden where they belonged. The Johnsons' teenagers brought friends over without fear of excessive youth congregation citations. Tom Bradley installed a flagpole in his front yard, flying both the American flag and a black POW MIA banner that honored his service and his struggles. My own driveway became something of a neighborhood symbol, always clear, always accessible, and somehow representing the broader liberation we'd all experienced. Kids would ride their bikes through it during street hockey games. Neighbors would use it as a meeting point for morning walks. And visiting delivery drivers knew they could park there without fear of mysterious citations appearing on their windshields. But the most profound changes were in the people themselves. Neighbors who'd lived as strangers for years, connected only by shared fear of HOA retaliation, began building actual relationships. Block parties replaced board meetings as the primary community gathering. Genuine conversations about shared concerns replaced whispered complaints about petty violations. The new HOA board, elected in a process that actually involved resident input, operated with radical transparency. Monthly meetings were open forums where homeowners discussed real issues: playground maintenance, snow removal, community garden planning, rather than sitting silently while self-appointed authorities dictated acceptable paint colors and grass heights. Jessica Hayes, freed from Karen's toxic influence, emerged as a thoughtful advocate for balanced community standards that protected property values without destroying quality of life. Her experience as an unwilling participant in Karen's harassment campaigns gave her unique insight into preventing future abuses of power. We learned that accountability isn't just about following rules. Jessica told the packed community center during her first meeting as the new HOA president. It's about making sure the people making the rules remember their neighbors first, not rulers. The legal aftermath of Karen's crimes continued to unfold with the methodical precision of real justice. Her criminal trial resulted in convictions on multiple felony counts, leading to 2 years in state prison and 5 years of probation. The restitution order required her to repay the embezzled HOA funds plus damages, effectively ensuring that her financial recovery would take decades if it happened at all. Mark. Stevens's civil settlement included funding for community improvements that benefited everyone, new playground equipment, updated landscaping for common areas, and a community garden that became the neighborhood's pride and joy. His public apology, read at a packed community meeting, acknowledged his role in enabling Karen's harassment campaigns and pledged support for transparency measures designed to prevent future abuses. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was watching Karen's broader network of suburban tyranny collapse. Other HOA boards that had hired her consulting services found themselves under investigation as victims came forward with their own horror stories. The methods she'd refined in Maple Valley Estates, surveillance, Harassment, financial manipulation, selective enforcement had been exported across the county, leaving a trail of damaged communities and traumatized families. Linda Morrison's divorce proceedings became public record, revealing the depth of her participation in Karen's campaigns and the toll it had taken on her marriage. Paul Morrison, finally free from his wife's toxic influence, became an advocate for HOA reform, sharing his insider knowledge of Karen's methods with investigators and community groups throughout the region. The ripple effects extended far beyond our neighborhood boundaries. County officials, embarrassed by the scope of HOA abuses that had operated under their jurisdiction, implemented new oversight requirements for homeowners associations. State legislators, responding to media coverage of Karen's crimes, introduced bills requiring financial transparency and resident protections for all HOA operations. My brother Danny found himself something of a celebrity in code enforcement circles, his handling of the commercial vehicle case becoming a textbook example of how municipal authority could be used to protect residents from HOA overreach. He began teaching seminars for other enforcement officers, sharing techniques for identifying and addressing systematic harassment campaigns disguised as legitimate community management. Tony, Ricci's towing company, experienced an unexpected boom in business as word spread about his role in Karen's downfall. Other neighborhoods began calling him to remove illegally parked vehicles, with homeowners finally confident that legitimate enforcement wouldn't result in retaliation from HOA bullies. But the most meaningful changes were personal and ongoing. Mrs. Chen, at 85, began hosting weekly coffee meetings in her backyard, creating a space where neighbors could share concerns and coordinate community activities. These informal gatherings became more effective at addressing real issues than years of formal HOA meetings had ever been. The Johnsons' daughter, inspired by her experience documenting Karen's breakdown during the towing incident, started a neighborhood newsletter that covered community events, celebrated resident achievements, and provided a forum for genuine discussion about shared concerns. Her articles about the Karen era became historical documentation of how quickly a community could be transformed by fear and how it could be reclaimed through courage. Tom Bradley's journey back to full community participation became an inspiration for other veterans in neighboring developments who'd faced similar harassment. For their disability accommodations or military service indicators, his success in standing up to Karen's intimidation campaigns sparked a broader movement of veterans' rights advocacy in HOA disputes throughout the region. Even Paul Morrison found new purpose in his freedom from Linda's influence. He joined the new HOA board as treasurer, bringing his insider knowledge of financial manipulation to help design transparency measures that would prevent future embezzlement. His transformation from reluctant enabler to active reformer demonstrated how toxic leadership could corrupt even good people, and how healing was possible when the source of toxicity was removed. As for me, I discovered that my role in Karen's downfall had given me something I'd never expected: genuine roots in a community that had finally learned to value its residents over its regulations. The peace and space I'd originally sought in Maple Valley Estates had materialized, but in a form deeper and more meaningful than mere quiet suburban living. My driveway, once a battlefield in Karen's war against anyone who dared to resist her authority, became a symbol of something larger. Clear and open, it represented access, not just to my garage, but to the kind of life we all deserved. The freedom to come and go without surveillance, to live without fear of petty retaliation, to be part of a community rather than subjects of a fiefdom. The morning routine that had once included checking for new citations or anonymous threats now involved genuine interactions with neighbors heading to work, kids waiting for school buses, and elderly residents taking their morning walks. The transformation was so complete that newcomers to the neighborhood couldn't imagine how different things had been just months earlier. But we who lived through the Karen era never forgot. The experience taught us that vigilance was the price of community freedom, that bullies often disguise themselves as protectors, and that real authority came from service to others rather than power over them. The story became legend in our corner of suburbia, not just the dramatic towing incident that broke Karen's power, but the broader lesson about how ordinary people could reclaim their community from extraordinary bullies. Other neighborhoods facing similar tyranny reached out for advice, guidance, and sometimes just inspiration that change was possible. They thought parking a car could block me, but all it did was clear the way for justice, for truth, and for a community finally free to discover what it could become when fear no longer governed its choices. Karen's car was gone in 10 minutes, hauled away by chains and hydraulics and the inexorable force of actual justice. But the chains she and her collaborators had tried to wrap around our community, the surveillance, the harassment, the manufactured fear that kept neighbors from knowing each other, those broke forever the moment we learned that real power belonged to us, not to self-appointed guardians of suburban perfection. In the end, this wasn't just about one blocked driveway or one neighborhood bully or even one corrupt HOA board. It was about something bigger, the right of ordinary people to live ordinary lives without extraordinary harassment, the power of community when people choose courage over convenience, and the beautiful truth that bullies, no matter how sophisticated their methods or complete their apparent control, are ultimately paper tigers who collapse the moment their victims refuse to be afraid. My driveway remains clear to this day, not because of any rule or regulation, but because we live in a community where respect is earned through service rather than demanded through intimidation, where authority exists to protect rather than control, where home truly means the place where you belong, not the place where you're constantly watched for signs of non-compliance with someone else's vision of perfection.